So, in today's video we're going to take a look at an I-splice in core-dependent spectral rope. So the equipment that you're going to need for this, not all of the gear I've got here is required, but a leather glove is quite handy if the rope proves hard to splice, saves your palms. A palm for sewing, needle and thread with the sailmaker's needle, PVC tape, the hardware that's going to get spliced onto the rope, a hammer in case it proves particularly recalcitrant, scissors, not always necessary, a sharp knife definitely, marker pen, a selection of fibs depending on the specific job, and this one here, which is a Swedish fid or hollow fid, and a lighter. So that's pretty much the gear that all the gear you might possibly need to complete an I-splice in core-dependent line. So, taking your line, when you buy the line, give yourself at least an additional ½ meter over the finished length, depending on the line diameter, to allow for the length of the splice. So I'm just going to lay the line down and measure out around 5 meters, and then in the end of that I'm going to tie a figure of 8 knot with a loop in the end. This will stop the cover of the splice when I'm working on the rope disappearing up the line, and also allow me to drop the line over something to secure it. Okay, so after I've secured the knot, work back to the end of the line. Now if the line has been cut by a hot knife, we need to cut off the slightly melted part of the core so that we can pull it out. I'm just going to bring across my splicing box and trim. Did I say sharp knife? There's the blade for safety. We're now going to form the loop and decide on the size of the eye. So if this is 8mm line, and I don't want a particularly big eye, but and the berry on the line for 8mm will be something around 400mm. So there we go, and I'm just going to put a little mark with my marker pen on where I want the neck of the splice to be. We then take the Swedish fid, and I'm just going to move in a bit closer so that we can see precisely how this works. We loosen, we push together the cover of the line and insert the fid between the pecks, the individual strands of the line. And we're basically trying to extract the core from the cover without disturbing the cover too much. This can be quite fiddly, and particularly if you find yourself having to splice an old line or a line that's been used. So we just gently tease it out, trying to make sure that we don't damage the cover of the line. New line, particularly Spectra, Dyneema, SK, is nice and slippery, so it's actually quite nice to splice. Now I've got the core of the line coming out of the cover, so I'm going to extract the core. The next phase is quite important, which is to, before we start the splice, to pull the core out and work the cover back all the way to the knot. Now at this stage, if you've forgotten to put the knot in, you'll have a small problem, but seeing as we haven't, we're okay. We go back to the knot and pull, working the cover back. Now you'll note that by doing that, the core has not returned to exactly the same position it was before I pulled it out. if you don't go through that process, the rope becomes incredibly difficult to splice and to bury the last part of the splice. So I'm just going to work that back one more time. And we now have a point which we need to mark, which is where the core exits from the cover. Let's put a little dot on there, and then pull out again, pulling all the way back to the knot. So we now have the core of the line, and I'm about to load this onto the fid. So the fid in this case, there are two choices. I've got a little hollow fid here, and I think I'm going to use this one. You just push the line in. Now we could put a little piece of tape on here first, just to make sure that it engages nicely with the end of the fid. So a bit of tape in there. It's just started to rain, lovely. And there we're going to tape that end onto the fid. Just rotate the fid round and keep the tape nice and tight. It's very important with this that there are no little bits of tape sticking out, otherwise when we go to make our splice that will pick up the inner strands of the line. Okay, at this juncture it is critical to put on the piece of hardware that you're going to splice. So the core goes through the bail of the shackle, and we're now going to find the point at which we made the neck of our splice earlier. So there's my second mark. Again, we just open up the line a bit. I can use the Swedish fid to just tease the weave of the line apart, and I insert the fid here. Now, because we have fids of different sizes, it's important to have the right sized fid for the line. If the fid's too big, you won't be able to complete this part of the process. So as we start pulling through, if you haven't taped on nicely, the core can pull out of the fid, so you just need to be a little bit gentle and pull through. We're now going to pull through until our red mark that we put on the core is just past the neck again. And the next phase is we're going to basically put the shackle inside what will then be the eye. Now that we've put the shackle into what will be the loop of the splice, we're going to take the fid and keep the core in, and we're going to put the core back into the core of the rope. So about 3 of the core diameters down from the splice, I'm going to insert the fid and just feed it through the core of the line. Now, at this stage it's really important not to pick up or have the fid come out of the line, but to make sure that it runs smoothly through the centre. So keep on going, and we want to basically have all the core that's connected to the fid buried inside the core of the line. So based on the fid length here, I can exit now, and I'm just going to pull that so that it's closed. At this point we can remove the fid and remove the tape. Don't worry about cutting the end of the line here because this is going to get tapered. So we now have the core coming back out of the core. The next part of this is to taper this core so we don't end up with the hard spot at the end of that line. So I'm going to pull out individual strands and holding nice and tightly so it doesn't slip, trim off, then work down the line again, pull out another piece, cut, and on we go. Get a bit greedy, do 2 at once. until we end up with probably 2 strands at the very end. So the taper should probably be done over roughly half of the berry of the splice. So at this point we make sure that we've got the cover at the neck of the splice, and then slide it down. So that's actually the splice done, but all we need to do now is get the core back into the cover. So we're now going to bury the tail, the empty tail of the cover, back into the cover so that we have a nice neat and tidy splice. There is a shortcut to this which we might look at in another video. But, so what I've done is I've tapered the cover, and then I've taped it onto a very narrow fit. This is just a bit of steel rod with a flattened end. So I've tried to make this as small as possible so that I can feed it through the now quite restricted space here. So it's very important when we do this that we don't pick up any of the cover that's inside the line, but we only go through the gap between the cover and the core. So I'm going to go down about 2 inches, it's more than enough. So again, exiting between the little strands of line. And this is going to take some persuasion to come through without actually pulling off the fig. So that's a combination of push and pull and wiggle. And teasing, and there we go. Here she comes. So I'm just going to leave a little bit of slack there, and enough line at the other end that I can then pull it tight at the end of the splice. Now comes the magic part. We're going to take that knot and drop it over a winch up here on the coach roof and work the cover down back towards the splice. I'm just going to go around this other winch. Cover work down, and I don't know whether you can see here, but as I pull the cover down, it disappears back into the line. This is the point at which you may want to put your glove on, because it can get quite hard on the hands. It takes a bit of pulling, so if you're doing this at home you need a very secure anchor point to do this pull. So if you just have a close look at that, we're just getting close to being able to get that buried. I'll go back, grab a bit more cover. Around the winch a couple of times. And work down, you can see the slack of the cover there, and that magic feeling of slipping inside the cover. Now, if we can just come in a bit closer here, you can just see a little bit of the core still exposed, and so I'm going to work splice round, and at this point we can start pulling in this tail of the cover, making sure that it wants to tend to lie flat. Still got a little bit exposed there, so it's a bit more work to do on this. Right. So, there we have the splice. Still a little bit of tidying up to do. So the next stage, of course, we need to get rid of this tail of cover. So I'm just going to pull this out slightly, pull it nice and tight, and we simply trim it off, being very careful not to cut the actual working cover of the line. So there's trimmed off, and as we snug it back, that will disappear. So just work the splice so that everything's evenly loaded, the cover and the core. And there is splice. The final thing to do with this is to finish it off with a whipping. If we don't whip it, then there's a possibility over time that the splice can work itself loose. So even though it looks very tidy now, a whipping is an important part of it. And also before the splice is used, I'm going to just load it up on a winch and make sure that everything lines up properly before I do the whipping. Okay, so just to finish off and make sure everything's bedded in, just clip the line on to something, a secure point, and give it a few sharp tugs. Of course, once the line loads up, that will also deal with any irregularities. We're now going to put a whipping in the end just to secure this and lock it off. So for the whipping, sailmaker's needle, sailmaker's thread, pull off around a metre and a half or something. Metre's probably enough. Load onto the needle the glasses, and pull the twine back down so that you've doubled up the whipping. Then, in order to hold the whipping in place, we just sew through both parts of the whipping, locked in. At this point you might want to put on your sailmaker's palm. And we're going to do a whipping which is roughly 1 diameter of the line. So, load it. To stick through, and I'm going to cheat here slightly just by using a pair of pliers to get this through. This needle's got quite a large head. So drawing the line through until we've got around 1 inch exposed. And then wrap round, trying to keep the 2 pairs of threads nicely parallel. Make a couple of turns before you pull tight, otherwise you'll pull the whipping straight out again. At each turn, just give it a nice tight pull. And go around a couple more times and then sew through again to lock it off. And I'm just going to slightly cheat. This is a rather old and rusty needle. So through once, and then we could make a sailmaker's whipping, which would be very tidy but fairly time consuming, or we'll just sew back again, and that will be sufficient to lock off the whipping twine. So give it a nice snug pull. Going to trim off the excess thread, and with our lighter just burn the ends. And that is a completed